The gauge did not fail loudly. It hesitated once, then stopped responding altogether. Those standing nearby assumed the machine had malfunctioned until the engineer quietly reached forward and switched it off himself. 3 seconds earlier, he had said it was impossible. Not unlikely, not impractical, impossible.
The tightrope is slack to rig. Keep pushing, you're doing great. The gauge is climbing.
What followed was not an argument, not a demonstration meant for spectacle, and not an explanation. It was a brief interaction between a man and a machine, witnessed by a small group and spoken about carefully for years afterward, because no one could fully explain what they had seen, only what the instrument no longer could measure. The room was not large, and it was not designed for spectacle. Its purpose was narrow and precise. Everything inside it existed to remove uncertainty. The walls were bare, painted in a pale industrial color meant to reflect light evenly. Overhead, fluorescent fixtures hummed with a steady, almost clinical consistency. There were no windows. Outside variables, weather, distraction, noise, were excluded by intention. What remained was an environment built to observe cause and effect without interference. At the center of the room stood the machine. It was a power-measuring apparatus used for testing strike force, not a novelty device and not a training aid, but a calibrated instrument intended to translate human movement into numerical data. Force plates, internal springs, and a reinforced gauge were housed within a thick steel frame. The display was analog, not digital, chosen deliberately because it allowed engineers to see fluctuation, hesitation, and stress in real time. This was not equipment designed to impress martial artists. It was designed to satisfy engineers. The machine had limits. Those limits were not theoretical. They were calculated, tested, and verified through repeated trials. Industrial presses, weighted pendulums, and mechanical impacts had already defined its upper range. When the needle reached its maximum marking, it meant something specific. Beyond this point, the structure itself would absorb no more force without risk of damage. That ceiling was known, trusted, respected. Around the machine stood a small group of observers. They were not an audience in the conventional sense. No one had gathered to be entertained. Most were technicians or associates connected to the testing process. A few had been invited because of professional curiosity. Some had simply remained in the room after previous demonstrations. Conversations were muted and technical. Numbers were referenced casually, without emphasis. There was no sense of anticipation in the air. If anything, the mood leaned toward routine. Bruce Lee was present, but not positioned as a central figure. He was not introduced formally. No one announced his credentials. He did not warm up publicly or stretch in a way that drew attention. To many in the room, he appeared as another participant, compact, quiet, observant. He spent time near the machine, not touching it, only watching as others interacted with it. He observed how the needle reacted, how the housing responded, how the technicians adjusted the calibration between tests. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his attention was consistent. The engineers spoke freely in front of him. They discussed tolerances, stress thresholds, and safety margins. They referenced previous data points with confidence. The machine had been reliable, predictable. It had never behaved unexpectedly. That reliability was the foundation of the room. Nothing about the setting suggested a challenge was about to occur. There was no tension, no confrontation, and no declared intent to prove anything. What existed instead was a quiet trust in systems, mechanical, mathematical, and human. In that room, authority did not come from reputation. It came from instruments that had never lied. Bruce Lee listened. He did not interrupt. He did not correct anyone. He did not volunteer a demonstration. At that moment, there was no conflict to observe, only a space designed to measure force, and a man who understood that measurement begins long before contact is made. The machine stood ready, indifferent and precise. and the room remained exactly as it had been built to be, controlled, certain, and unprepared for anything outside its scale. The confidence in the room did not belong to any individual. It belonged to the machine. Its authority had been earned through repetition, through controlled tests conducted under conditions far more extreme than human movement. The engineers trusted it not because it was impressive, but because it was consistent. When force was applied, it responded exactly as expected. When limits were reached, it showed them clearly. There was comfort in that predictability. One of the engineers, older, deliberate in speech, stood closest to the gauge. He had been involved in the apparatus's design and calibration. To him, the machine was not a tool of curiosity, it was an extension of calculation. Every component inside it had a tolerance rating. Every reading was grounded in known values. He explained this without defensiveness. The maximum range of the gauge was not an estimate. It had been established using mechanical impactors and weighted systems that could deliver force repeatedly without variation. Human strikes, by comparison, were considered inefficient, limited by coordination, structural alignment, and biological constraints. The assumption was not arrogant. It was practical. The machine had already recorded strikes from trained athletes, boxers, martial artists, military personnel. The readings varied, but always within a predictable band. Skill improved consistency, not magnitude. Power peaked, plateaued, and declined as fatigue set in. That pattern had never been broken. Bruce Lee remained nearby, listening. At one point, a technician adjusted the gauge back to 0 and commented casually on the safety margin. Even if the needle reached its maximum, the housing would hold. The internal mechanisms were reinforced. Failure was not part of the expected outcome. Someone asked, half seriously, what would happen if the limit were exceeded. The engineer answered without hesitation. It would not be exceeded. The statement was not dismissive, it was factual, delivered the way one might state that water boils at a certain temperature. The machine defined the boundary. Human effort existed within it. Bruce Lee did not respond immediately. When he did speak, it was not to challenge the statement. He asked a question instead, brief, technical, and directed at the machine rather than the man. Something about response delay, about how quickly the gauge registered peak force. The engineer answered, slightly surprised by the specificity. The response time was nearly instantaneous. Any significant force would be captured. That exchange passed quickly. It did not shift the room's mood. No one leaned forward, no one stopped what they were doing. But something subtle changed. The discussion moved from abstract capability to immediate possibility. The machine, once a static authority, became an object of attention. People looked at it differently, not as a fixed standard, but as something about to be used again. Still, there was no sense of confrontation. Bruce Lee did not argue limits. He did not reference his training or reputation. He did not claim exception. If anything, his manner suggested acceptance of the constraints being described. That acceptance was disarming. The engineer continued speaking, outlining why human biomechanics naturally dissipate force. Muscles absorb energy, joints flex, structure yields. Machines do not. The logic was sound, and yet the room grew quieter. Not because doubt had entered, but because attention had narrowed. The conversation had reached a point where explanation could only go so far. Beyond that, the instrument itself would speak. The machine stood unchanged, its needle resting calmly at 0. It had measured countless impacts. It had never been wrong. And in that certainty, the engineer saw no reason to hesitate when the next test was suggested. What he did not see, what no calculation in the room accounted for, was the difference between producing force and delivering it. That distinction had not yet been demonstrated. The suggestion did not arrive as a challenge. It surfaced as an aside. One of the technicians, resetting the gauge again, mentioned that if anyone wanted to try the machine, now would be the time. The tone was casual, procedural. The machine was already calibrated. There would be no disruption. A few people declined with polite gestures. They had seen the numbers before. There was little novelty in repeating them. Bruce Lee stepped forward without announcement. He did not claim a turn. He did not ask permission in a way that drew attention. He simply moved closer to the apparatus and looked toward the engineer, as if confirming that participation was acceptable. The engineer nodded, more out of courtesy than curiosity. There was no shift in posture among the observers. No one expected anything beyond another data point, another reading that would sit comfortably within the known range. As Bruce Lee positioned himself, the engineer spoke again. His voice was level, almost instructional. He explained that the gauge would register peak force only if the strike was delivered cleanly. Poor alignment or excessive follow-through could reduce the reading. He added, without emphasis, that even a perfect strike would not approach the upper limit. Then he paused. Not because he needed to, because he was being precise. He said that exceeding the machine's maximum reading was impossible. The word carried weight not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. In technical environments, impossibility is not declared lightly. It represents the end of consideration. No one reacted audibly. The statement did not provoke laughter or disagreement. It settled into the room as a settled matter. Bruce Lee acknowledged it with a slight nod. He did not correct the engineer. He did not reframe the claim. He did not attempt to soften it. There was no visible change in his expression. If anything, his response suggested agreement. That reaction, more than any verbal challenge, shifted the attention in the room. The observers began to watch more closely, not because they expected contradiction, but because something about the exchange felt unresolved. The certainty had been stated too cleanly. The acceptance had been too calm. Bruce Lee adjusted his stance in a way that was easy to miss. There was no dramatic lowering of posture, no exaggerated chambering of the arm. His feet aligned naturally, his shoulders remained relaxed, his hand hung loosely at his side. He took a moment not to prepare, but to observe. He looked at the surface of the machine where impact would be made. Not at the gauge, not at the audience, at the point of contact. The engineer glanced toward the needle, already anticipating the movement it would make. He had seen it hundreds of times. A quick rise, a brief vibration, then a return to rest. That expectation was shared by everyone present. The doubt in the room, if it could be called that, was not about whether the machine would function. It was about why this moment felt different despite offering no visible reason. Bruce Lee did not speak again. There was no countdown, no signal, no warning. The room did not hold its breath. It did not need to. What followed would not announce itself through sound or speed. It would be noticed only after it had already occurred. And by the time the engineer looked up from the gauge, the assumption he had stated so calmly was already in the process of unraveling. There was no visible effort preceding the strike. Bruce Lee's arm did not draw back. His shoulders did not tense. To an untrained eye, it might have appeared that he barely moved at all. The action began and ended within a narrow range of motion, contained and economical. Those closest later described it differently. They said it felt less like a strike and more like a sudden compression of space, brief, localized, and immediately over. The contact itself produced no dramatic sound. There was no crack or echo, no sharp report that demanded attention. The noise, if it could be called that, was dull and controlled, absorbed almost instantly by the machine's housing. The needle moved. At first, it behaved exactly as expected. It rose sharply, cleanly, tracing a familiar path toward the upper markings. This was the moment the engineer recognized, the moment he had seen countless times before. Then, it did not slow. The needle reached the maximum reading and pressed beyond it, not with violence, but with insistence. For a fraction of a second, it hesitated against a boundary it had never crossed. The gauge face shuddered. What failed was not the housing, and not the surface of impact. It was the internal mechanism, the component responsible for translating force into measurement. The spring, calibrated for known extremes, yielded under a load it was never designed to register. The needle stopped responding. It did not snap backward. It did not oscillate. It simply ceased to function, frozen past its highest marking. Bruce Lee lowered his hand. He did not remain in position. He did not look at the gauge to confirm the result. He stepped back slightly, as if allowing space for others to approach. The room did not react immediately. There was no exclamation, no raised voices, and no sudden movement toward the machine. The moment passed in silence, not because of shock, but because no one was certain what they were observing. The engineer leaned in closer. He tapped the side of the gauge lightly, a habitual gesture meant to free a stuck needle. Nothing changed. He reset the dial. It did not return to zero. He knelt to inspect the housing, opening a panel with practiced hands. His movements were methodical, not rushed. He was not searching for damage. He was searching for explanation. The machine had not been struck improperly. The contact point showed no abnormal deformation. There was no sign of misuse. The failure was internal. Bruce Lee stood a short distance away, his posture neutral. He did not watch the inspection closely. His attention appeared to drift, as though the demonstration had already concluded in his mind. No one addressed him directly. The authority in the room had shifted, but not toward him. It had collapsed inward. The instrument that defined certainty no longer spoke. The engineer closed the panel slowly. He did not say the machine was broken. He did not say it had been exceeded. He said nothing at all. In that silence, the demonstration revealed its true nature. It had not been an attempt to prove strength. It had not been an act of defiance. It had been a brief interruption of assumption, delivered with such restraint that the absence of spectacle made it more difficult to dismiss. The machine, designed to measure force, could no longer do so, and the man who caused it had already stepped away, leaving the room to reckon with what its instruments could not contain. The first response was procedural. The engineer reached for his tools, not out of disbelief, but habit. Instruments fail for reasons, and reasons can usually be found. He checked the housing again, then the calibration settings. Another technician brought over a secondary gauge, smaller and less robust, intended for verification rather than primary testing. They spoke quietly among themselves, using the language of diagnostics. Spring fatigue, internal displacement, possible manufacturing variants. Each explanation was offered carefully, not as an excuse, but as a starting point. None of them fit. The machine had not been stressed repeatedly. It had not been overloaded over time. It had been used exactly as designed once, briefly, cleanly. There was no sign of misuse, no irregular angle of impact, no visible compromise in the structure. What had failed was not the frame, but the assumption behind it. Someone asked whether the gauge could be repaired. The engineer paused before answering. He said it could be replaced. The internal component could be swapped out and recalibrated. The machine itself would function again. But the reading that should have existed, there would be no recovering that. That distinction mattered. The machine had not recorded a number beyond its scale. It had simply stopped being able to translate force into data. The moment of excess existed only as a mechanical consequence, not a measurable value. In other words, the event could not be repeated on paper. The room grew quieter as this realization settled. The earlier certainty had not been overturned by argument or proof, but by absence. There was now a gap where data should have been. The engineer looked toward Bruce Lee, not with accusation, not with admiration, with recalibration. He asked a simple question, whether the strike had been delivered with full effort. Bruce Lee answered just as simply, no. There was no elaboration, no clarification of what that meant. The word stood alone, unadorned and unchallenged. The engineer nodded once. At that point, the conversation shifted away from numbers entirely. The technicians no longer discussed limits. They discussed mechanics of movement, alignment, timing, transmission of force. Not as abstractions, but as variables they had failed to account for. Bruce Lee did not lead that discussion. He answered questions when asked, briefly and without emphasis. He demonstrated nothing further. When someone suggested another attempt, he declined, not with refusal, but with disinterest. There was nothing left to show. The psychological impact of the moment unfolded slowly. No one raised their voice, no one announced a conclusion, but the hierarchy in the room had changed. The machine was no longer the final authority. It had become a reference point, useful but incomplete. The engineer shut down the apparatus. The action was deliberate. Testing for the day was over. As people began to leave, the incident was not discussed openly. There were no summaries, no shared conclusions. Each person carried away a slightly different version of what had happened, shaped by their own understanding of limits. Bruce Lee left quietly. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He did not seek explanation or validation. The demonstration had not been for the room. It had been for the assumption that had been stated aloud. Years later, when those present spoke of the incident, they rarely agreed on the details. Some remembered the needle freezing. Others remembered the silence afterward more clearly than the strike itself. What they all agreed on was this. From that day forward, they no longer spoke of human capability in terms of maximums. They spoke instead of efficiency. And the machine, repaired and recalibrated, continued to function, never again mistaken for the boundary of what it measured. The incident did not circulate widely at the time. There were no photographs taken of the damaged gauge. No formal report was written. The machine was repaired, recalibrated, and returned to service. On paper, nothing extraordinary had occurred. An internal component had failed and been replaced. The system worked again. But among those who had been in the room, the event did not disappear. It surfaced later in conversations that began with unrelated topics. It was mentioned cautiously, often prefaced with uncertainty. People would say they had seen something once but could not fully explain it. They would clarify that it was not dramatic, not violent, and not particularly loud. That lack of drama became part of the story. Over time, the focus shifted away from the broken gauge and toward the conditions that produced it. The controlled room, the absence of effort, the refusal to repeat the demonstration, the calm acknowledgement that full force had not been used. In retelling, the event lost any trace of competition. No one described it as a victory. There was no opponent to defeat, no record to break. What remained was a question that resisted easy answers. How much force is lost before it ever reaches the point of contact? Those who had trusted the machine most completely were often the ones most affected. Engineers and technicians, trained to rely on measurement, began to speak more carefully about limits. They did not abandon data, but they treated it with greater humility. Years later, some of them encountered Bruce Lee's work again, not in testing rooms, but in writing, interviews, and recorded demonstrations. They recognized patterns they had not understood at the time. Minimal motion, structural alignment, timing so precise it appeared effortless. The machine, they realized, had not been defeated. It had been bypassed. Bruce Lee himself rarely referenced the incident. When asked about tests of strength or power, he spoke instead about removing waste, about efficiency not as a concept, but as a practice. He did not describe breaking instruments or exceeding limits. He described learning to do less. The room where the test occurred changed over time. Equipment was upgraded. Analog gauges were replaced with digital displays capable of higher ranges. Testing protocols became more sophisticated. No similar failure occurred. And yet, the memory persisted, not because it could be replicated, but because it resisted simplification. The event refused to settle into a clean explanation. It lived instead as an unresolved moment, passed quietly between people who had been there. In later years, when Bruce Lee's reputation grew and his influence spread across disciplines, some of those witnesses recognized the significance of what they had seen. It had not been about power. It had been about understanding where power actually emerges and how rarely it needs to announce itself. The machine had been built to measure force, but what it encountered that day was not force in isolation, but precision refined beyond the assumptions of its design. That distinction could not be recorded. It could only be remembered. And so the story endured, not as a tale of domination, but as a lesson learned in silence, one that outlived the instrument, the room, and even the certainty that once defined them.